So here's the next job I'm going to do, fit the front fork springs. I've taken the right hand side fork off, and I'm not going to run through how you take forks out and all that. There's plenty of videos on that and it's not too hard. So I've taken the right hand side off. I'm just letting the oil drain out the fork at the moment. I've got the DFX valves to put in. So I've got DFX valves. I've got stronger springs. I've got 0.54s, which will probably be okay. And I've got a warp 9 fork brace, which means I have to put on shorter gaiters. So the original Suzuki gaiter is on the back, and my new fork gaiter is at the front here, and that'll fit at the top here once the warp 9 gaiter is in place. So as I said, I've got DFX valves, new fork springs, new gaiters, and then the warp 9 fork brace goes on at the end. And lots of instruction pages for each, and Vince Strang again supplied all this stuff, so thanks very much. We expect you to use a qualified mechanic. No chance. Thanks, Vince. So anyway, I've got to do it myself. And it doesn't look too hard. There seems to be some stuffing about with preload spacers that comes with this. So I'll have a look what that does. But basically, as I said, the fork comes off quite easily, and then you just slot everything back in and slide it back into place. I'm doing one fork at a time. I don't know if you have to do that or not, but I thought it would be easier to leave the other fork in place while I get one complete, and then I'll assemble this one and put the other one on. And at least then, if there's any movement in my triple clamp, it won't move, because the one fork will always be holding it in place. But it shouldn't be slack anyway, but I've had that happen before. So as I said, one fork at a time, and then I'll get it all back on. Of course, nothing in life is simple, and so the new springs are a different length, and they come with a spacer that you have to cut. And this is the old spacer here. So it's a pretty substantial piece of kit compared to the replacement. But I don't know if you can see that. It's actually got a positive preload, or even greater than the fork top. I don't know what that is. It must be about... Can't you actually see that? It's close to 3 mil, is it? 3 mil. So it's already got about a 3 mil preload on it, and then of course it gets 18 mil when you screw the fork top in. So that's actually more preload than just 18 mil fork top. So that complicates how you want to set up your new forks, because you have to cut a spacer off to get your preload right. So I'll muck about with some equations and see what that looks like. But it looks like I've got about 3 mil additional preload on the spacer before you actually even fit the fork top caps. Might be only 2 mil, but it's definitely not flush. You can see that it's not flush. Okay, so as usual, complicates installation, but let's see what I can do. Right, so back to the spreadsheet here. So this is my front fork springs. So it looks complicated, but it's actually quite easy. So remember, I'm trying to set my preload and sag. And all preload does is it's the force before the fork starts moving, and it also controls your sag. So on the left hand side here, I've got the standard spring. So the standard spring, I'm running Suzuki runs a spring rate of about 0.4 kilograms per millimeter, and it looks like the preload distance from the previous was 18 millimeters minimum if you just take the cap, but remember it was sticking up 2 or 3 mils, so there might be a max there of 21. So just multiplying your your kilogram per millimeters times millimeters, you get 7.2 kilograms per preload per fork. So on one side I've got either 7 or 8 kilograms preload applied to that fork. And the spacer from the top, as you can see there, it's either 3 mil or 0. And so that's your standard spring. But if you look at your travel here, so your max travel, it's quoted is about 10 inches. But if you read about Suzuki, it looks like you've only actually got about 8.25 inches of actual travel, which is about 210. And so for your static sag of about 10%, you're looking for between 21 and 26 mil. And for your race sag, which is your bike plus yourself, you're looking between 70 and 86 millimeters, assuming I've got the distribution of weight right. So if I've got a bike weight of 166, a rider weight of 105, and I might have 45 to 50% on the front. Right, so what I can do here is I can calculate the weight on the front of the bike, static and race. So the minimum is about 75, maximum is about 83. Race sags 122 and 136. These are kilograms. And then I know my spring rate. Remember, it's 2 forks, so it's 2 times your spring rate, and it's 2 times your preload. And so I know my spring rate, I know my preload, so I can calculate my sag. So the calculated static sag is 75 and 83 min to max, and my calculated race sag is 134 to 148 min to max, based on the uncertainty of my weight distribution and the preload. So you can see there, I want somewhere between 21 to 26 for my static sag, so I'm miles off on that. And I want somewhere between 70 and 86 for my race sag, and I'm almost double that, 134 and 138. So that's well off for the standard springs, and that's why I need to change the standard springs. The front end is just sagging too much. So Vince gives his setup in his instructions, so thanks for that, Vince, that's excellent. He runs 0.5 springs. He says he runs a preload of 12 millimeters, which is quite small. So his preload's only about 6 mil. So Vince is setting his springs up to sag a bit more and be a bit softer on the initial hit. So the spacer's about 6 mil from the top of his fork tube. So again, if you look at his sag, you calculate his ideal sag would be 26 to about 70 to 86. Vince gives his rider weight of 77. I presume that's his just normal weight. So if you add another maybe 8 kilos for gear, you're talking about 85. Again, 45% distribution to the front. You've got an equivalent spring rate there of 1 because there's 2 springs. You're getting preload of 12 because there's 2 springs, so he's getting a preload of 6 times 2. And so your calculated sag 63 and 101. And again, he's a little bit higher than that, but he does say in the instructions he likes a nice compliant front fork. So he's getting a little bit more sag from his setup. Okay, so let's go across now to the high caliber. So high caliber are a bit confusing. In the instructions, they say 3 to 10 millimeter preload in the leaflet, but the website says 15 to 25. So that gives quite a big range there, which gives you if you do the calculations, you just run through all the calculations again, you get somewhere between 66 to 44 for their preload sag, or their static sag, sorry, and you get about 110 to 88 for the race sag. So what I did is I said, well look, I want somewhere, I don't want to be at the top end of this because I don't want it to be too hard, but I'm not running it as soft as Vince. And so I've gone about 18 mil. So if I went 18 mil preload in the top spacer, which is basically, I'm relative to my top tube, it's flush with my top tube. I'm running 0.54 springs, which gives me a 9.7 preload per spring. You come down again, it calculates the weights. You've got an equivalent spring rate, i.e. 2 springs, equivalent preload, i.e. 2 preloads. You've got a static sag of about 51 and a race sag of about 95. And so that's pretty good. I'm happy with that. I've got a slightly bigger sag than 30%, but I'm pretty happy that it's given me enough sag to be reasonably compliant. I'm not putting too much preload on it. I think if I was going to do anything, I'd run with less sag. But look, if I put a 13mm spacer in there, which is sticking up 5mm, I only moved to 100mm race sag, so it doesn't actually make a great deal of difference. So again, if I go back to 18, it goes to 95, so I'll lose 5mm sag. So look, I'm quite happy with that. I'll run with my spacer to the top of the fork tubes, and it'll be 95 sag, which is a big difference. So, you know, you're talking about what's that, 130 to 148 on the original springs. So I'm gaining, you know, it's almost 50mm I'm gaining in my sag back in my front springs. So that's pretty good. So I reckon I'll run with that to start with. 18mm spacer, flush with the top tubes, gives me about just under 10 kilograms preload, and it'll give me a 95 sag. And there's not much you can do with the static sag. You just have to live with that. And so that works pretty well. I think a 95 race sag's pretty good, and it's within the range given by High Caliber on their website. So it does say put a 20mm preload on for a big tank, minimum to max. And so I'm sort of between the minimum it says, which is 15mm, and the big tank size, which is 20mm. And so I'm happy with that. 18mm, let's run with that. So here we are back at the bench after measuring what I want to do. So I'm probably going to have 18mm from the top of the tube, which is the cap length. And so these are the original spacers that came out. They're 37.25 in diameter and about 5mm thick, I think. So they're pretty good spacers. And the washer fits exactly. So they're 37.25 as well, by the looks of it. This is the tube that comes with the kit. And it's you can see there it's substantially different to the original spacers. That's only 32 diameter compared to 37, and then they come with these washers which are only 31 diameter compared to the 37 on the previous. So these are actually smaller than the tube, which means that they don't really want to sit. You know, they don't really want to sit on the tube. They'll move about quite a bit. So I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to rerun the original spacers with the original washer on top of the forks, and then I'll measure the amount I need on top, which will keep the spacer quite small. Another thing about a long tube is that long tubes can collapse easier. Just the nature of tube engineering. And so if I can keep that quite short. So what I've done is I've measured up the sizes to the top of the fork. So I've measured it 5 times, so I can guarantee it's going to be wrong. So from the top of the washer to the top of the fork, the left one's 67.6 and the right one is 66.4. Very small difference, probably due to spring compression or something like that. I have pulled my forks down as far as they'll go, so I think that's pretty right. So looks like I need 67 from the top of this washer. Now I know that's 40 exactly, so what I need is a tube length of 27. on top. So what I'm going to do is I'll use the plumber's cutter, and I'll cut 2 tubes of 27, and that'll give me my 18mm preload, and it'll help the bike set up a little bit when it's in touring sag, I call it. So race sag is me on it, and once all the equipment's loaded on and thing, it'll set a little bit, it won't sag as much, sorry. And so as I said, I'll cut a 27mm off this, 2 27s, I'll put them in the top of the forks, and that should be me finished with the front end. Let's see how I go. Right, that worked out better than I expected. 27mm spacer, I've just tidied it up a little bit on the edges to get that rough edge smoothed off, and that can go straight into the forks. So basically these two parts now will sit on the fork tops. So I've got the spacer in there already and the washer, and then they fit in. Now I have asked Vince about why he gave us this size of fork spacer and not one of the bigger ones. Comes in a slightly bigger size as well. Anyway, I'll wait to see what he comes back with. It's a bit late now, I've cut it. So that will just sit in there to give it the preload required. And that's it. So that's my, I'll get the fork tops on, and that's my front end nearly finished. I'll put the Warp 9 brace on as well. That goes up there between the forks, that's easy to fit. And then just bolt it all back together. Right, that's the front suspension finished. So I've got DFX valves sitting at the bottom. I've got 0.54 springs inserted. The Warp 9 fork brace, shorter gaiters because you're losing that much distance, and your traditional Suzuki gaiters are just too long and they get a bit foldy. And then as I've mentioned, I had the 18mm preload at the top. So that's me all set up, everything's all torqued up, everything's tightened up. These nuts here, by the way, they only require about 10 Newton meters, so it's nothing. So just be careful when you're tightening them up. They're only small threads, small bolts. Okay, that's it, that's the front end finished. Probably the next job after that is I've got my rear end suspension preload, and then my handlebars, and that's it, back together. Thanks for watching.